How can two aircraft be on the takeoff roll on the same runway at the same time? Sometimes it takes a truly bizarre incident in order to highlight weaknesses in a safety system, and this story I'm about to tell you is a perfect example of that. Stay tuned. The story I'm about to tell you took place on the 7th of March, 2020 at 9:48 Eastern Standard Time on Toronto Lester B. Pearson International Airport in Canada. Now, in order for you to understand how this incident could happen, we first need to start with explaining a little bit about the layout of the airport itself. The airport consists of 5 different runways connected by taxiways and aprons. On the south side of the airport, you have 2 parallel runways, runway 6 left and right, and 24 left and right. On the center part, you have 2 more parallel runways, runway 15 left and right, and 33 left and right. And then on the northern side, there is a singular runway wrong with 0523. The incident that I'm about to tell you about took place in Rome with 06 left, but the fact that both rumble 006 left and runway 605 was in use at the same time is going to play a role here. The air traffic control tower is situated at the center of the airport. This means that the controllers in the tower will have a great view of what's happening on every part of the airport, but it also means that some parts of the runways are quite far away from them. So in order for them to be able to see what was going on, they would need binoculars from time to time inside the tower. There are 9 air traffic control workstations, and at the time of the incident, 4 of those workstations were occupied. 2 of those controllers were busy handling all the ground movements on the taxiways, and aprons 1 was dealing with giving out air traffic control clearances on the clearance delivery frequency, and one of the controllers were in charge of all of the takeoff and landings. That controller was sitting at the workstation of the north controller position, which meant that he had an unobstructed forward view of runway 60523 and also of the center runways, runway 15 left and right and 33 left and right, and those were the runways that the north tower controller would be normally handling. But at the time of the incident, the amount of movements at the airport, as in takeoffs and landings, were considered moderate to sometimes light, and that meant that this controller was working in something called a combined position. This meant that he was covering the workload for both the north and the south controller. And since runway 06 left was in use, as well as runway 05, in order for this controller to be able to see what was going on with 06 left and give clearances there, he needed to stand up on his workstation, turn around 180 degrees, and look over the heads of his colleagues. Now, this was not normally a problem. He had a good view from there, and this is something that they would normally do. Air traffic controllers have access to a lot of different tools and warning systems in order to increase their situational awareness, tell them what is going on in their area of responsibility, and also to warn them in case something is about to go wrong. One of those systems is called RIMCAST, which stands for Runway Incursion Monitoring and Conflict Alert System. Dreamcast is part of the new Advanced Surface Movement Guidance Control System, or ASMCS. This system fuses together information from a lot of different sources, including ground radar, but also the ADS transponder systems inside of the aircraft themselves, and this is supposed to be far superior to the older warning systems that were much more reliant on only ground radar, and because of that gave a lot of false warnings and wasn't very reliable. Now, the way that Dreamcast works is that it divides its warnings into 2 different stages, Stage 1 and Stage 2 warnings. Like I mentioned before, it utilizes ground radar and the AD status of aircraft to determine where the aircraft are and if they are in conflict with each other, as in if they're sharing a runway, for example. But then it also takes into consideration whether or not these aircraft are airborne or how quickly they are approaching each other in order to determine which type, if any, warning it's going to issue. A Stage 1 alert is issued when Dreamcast feels that 2 or more targets are on the same runway at the same time. This is just a graphical alert on the screen. It doesn't have any audio elements to it. And it is inhibited when RIMCAST feels that one of the targets, the one in front, is accelerating away from the other target with more than 50 knots. A Stage 2 alert is both a visual on screen alert and an aura to highlight to the controller that something serious might be about to happen. Now the Stage 2 alert is issued when a target is felt to be in front of an aircraft that is accelerating for departure with a higher speed than 20 knots. This alert is inhibited if the target in front is felt to be accelerating away from the target behind, because that will be interpreted as a departing aircraft and thus not a threat. Both of these warnings are inhibited if any of the targets are sent to be in the air as an airborne, because this is an on-ground collision warning system. And that brings us to the next interesting part of this puzzle, which is how the aircraft in themselves sends that they're airborne, and when they send that information out to ADS, almost all modern transport category aircraft have something called weight-on-wheel switches, and those are connected to their air data inertial reference units. And when the aircraft gets airborne, those weight-on-wheel switches will feel that the aircraft is no longer on the ground, and they will send the signals up through the air data inertia reference units into the transponder and out via ADS, saying, "I am now airborne." These systems are generally very good and reliable, but there have been some instances where they haven't worked, and because the whole idea with the aircraft sending out its status as being on the ground or in the air was to start activating the CAS system to highlight potential conflicts and collisions in the air. The system needed to have some kind of safeguard because of that and the need for redundancy. It was also decided that these aircraft would include a system that would feel if the aircraft reached a speed of minimum 100 knots, and if it did so, it would send out an in-the-air signal no matter what the weight-on-wheel switches were saying. And that's going to become important here now on the day of the incident. The weather was really nice. It was only some very high clouds, light winds, very good visibility, and a temperature of -5 degrees Celsius. The controller had started his shift at 06:15 in the morning, and he had rotated through several different controller positions. Until that time, 709:30, he took on the role as a tower controller. Because the weather was nice, he used something called pilot-applied visual separation rules between the parting aircraft. What this means is that it's up to the pilots in the aircraft behind to maintain visual separation between him and the preceding aircraft of the departure, and by doing this, the controller could save a lot of time, because using the normal separation rules applied when the weather is less good would extend the distance between each departing aircraft quite a lot. Now, this type of very tight separation can only be used if there's no risk of wake turbulence to the aircraft behind. This tends to happen if a large aircraft, a heavy aircraft depart. It creates these very, very strong wake vortices behind the wings, and those can actually be dangerous. So if a large aircraft is departing, you're going to have to extend the separation anyway. But if it's a relatively small aircraft departing, that is not going to be a problem, and you can keep the departures really, really tight. Now you might ask yourself, why is it so important to keep the departures that tight, those aircraft so close to each other? But what you have to remember is that if a controller can manage to shave off a few seconds of each departure, it means that they can actually get away quite a few more aircraft during any given hour, and this means fewer delays for the passengers, shorter on ground time for the airlines, which ultimately saves a lot of money. So this is something that any professional air traffic controller is trying to achieve now. When pilot-applied visual separation rules are enforced, the air traffic control is not supposed to give the takeoff clearance to the following aircraft until the preceding aircraft is airborne. The controllers will perceive the aircraft to be airborne when they initiate the rotation, because they know that the pilots have done past their V1 decision speed and that they are committed to the takeoff. Most experienced controllers will have learned where different aircraft types typically start to rotate on the runway, and when they see that those aircraft are passing that part of the runway, they might start to initiate the takeoff clearance for the following aircraft, because they know that giving the takeoff clearance and having that aircraft reading that takeoff clearance back will take a few seconds, at which point that previous aircraft is going to be well airborne. At Time City 948, this is 18 minutes after the ATC controller has taken up the role as tower controller in the tower, and Air Canada Embraer 190 with 83 passengers on board, 2 cabin crew, and 2 pilots are getting ready for takeoff at runway 06 left. The tower controller tells them to enter the runway, and he gives them the takeoff clearance. The pilots on board the Embraer start to advance their thrust levels for takeoff, and the aircraft starts accelerating down the runway. As the embryo passes 50 knots, the ADS system inside of the aircraft sends a signal to the RIM CAS system inside of the control tower, saying that it's now airborne. Like we were discussing before, this is happening well before the aircraft is actually airborne. It will be accelerating for many more seconds, but it now shows up as airborne on the rimcast display, sending out the airborne signal at 50 knots is much earlier than most other aircraft would do. Most other aircraft will do it at 100 knots. But it's still okay according to the current rules now. As this is happening and the Embraer continues to accelerate down the runway, the aircraft controller clears another Air Canada aircraft, a Boeing 777 with 345 passengers on board, 2 pilots, and a 12-cabin crew, to enter the runway lineup and wait for departure. The Boeing 777 is significantly bigger than the departing Embraer 190 ahead of them, so wake turbulence is not going to be a problem, and the pilots line up on the runway and gets ready for an immediate takeoff. Whenever they get the clearance on boarding Embraer 190, everything is now looking normal, and when the controller sees that the Embraer is passing the point on the runway where he is pretty confident that it's just about to rotate, the controller starts issuing the takeoff clearance for the Boeing 777 behind them. This was read back by the pilots in the 777, and they started advancing their trust level for takeoff, initiating their own take of roll now. They could still see the Embraer in front of them, but they were also pretty confident that he was just about to get airborne here or there. Might be some differences between the rules in North America and the rules that applies to us here in Europe, because I would not be allowed to start my takeover unless the preceding aircraft has gotten airborne. There's also more rules in Europe when it comes to the vertical separation needed during standard instrument departures, so it is unlikely that this type of clearance would have been issued in this way in Europe. But in Canada at the time, this was perfectly normal when the Boeing 777 pilots had read back their takeoff clearance. The air traffic controller perceived that there was nothing more for him to monitor at that time on this runway, so he turned back on to his nodly-facing tower position in order to monitor some landing traffic on runway 05. But now comes the problem, because as the air traffic controller was giving the takeoff clearance to the Boeing 777 behind them, the pilots in the Embraer noticed that a big bird passed just below the side window on the captain's side. They could both hear how it impacted the body, and the captain thought that there was a major risk that this bird would be sucked into the left-hand engine. And because he thought so, he immediately initiated a rejected takeoff. This happened at 139 knots, which is just a couple of knots short of the V1 speed of 146 knots. So the fact that the controller had judged the Embraer's position on the runway as being close to takeoff is completely understandable. However, now the Embraer is not taking off anymore. It's about to stop on the runway ahead of the huge Boeing 777 behind them. The Embraer pilots now followed standard rejected takeoff procedures, and part of those procedures was that the first officer needed to call air traffic control and tell them that they were rejecting the takeoff. Unfortunately, as he was doing this at the exact same time, the first officer in the Boeing 777 behind them also read back their takeoff clearance, and because the output strength of the radio inside of the Boeing 777 was submitted stronger than the Embraer's radio, this completely masked the message from the Embraer, meaning that not only did the air traffic controller not hear that the Embraer was rejecting the takeoff, neither did the pilots inside of the Boeing 777 behind them. The pilots of the Boeing 777 is now in the middle of their own takeoff roll, and they can still see the Embraer ahead of them, but they're still assuming that it's about to take off, because judging the distance and the speed of an object ahead of you when you're moving yourself is very, very hard. The controller, on the other hand, is looking the other way towards runway 05, where he has landing traffic coming in, and the rimcast system on his screen ahead of him is not giving out any type of warning, because the Embraer, even though it's decelerating now, is still above 50 knots, which means that it's still indicating airborne. The tower controller now turns back toward runway 06 left again, and he clears another aircraft at de Havilland 8 to enter the runway to get ready for takeoff, which means that there are now 3 aircraft on this runway at the same time. But Dreamcast is still not giving off any warning, because now the Embraer is indicated as airborne, and the Boeing 777 has accelerated to above 100 knots, which means that it is also indicated as airborne on his screen. The Boeing 777 continues to accelerate down the runway, and the pilots are now starting to get really worried about what they're seeing in front of them, because in front of them, the Embraer has reduced their speed to well below 50 knots now and starting to come almost to a full stop, but the rimcast is still not activating, because now the Boeing 777 is shown as airborne and the Dash 8 has still not entered onto the runway behind them. As the Boeing 777 reaches 127 knots, the captain decides to reject the takeoff at this point. That's about 5,000 feet in between the Embraer and the 777, which is about 1,650 meters, and it's shrinking very fast. Obviously, now some of you might ask yourself, wouldn't it be more logical or even safer for the Boeing 777 to just continue to accelerate and take off above the Embraer in a situation like this? And while that would have been the case, if they would have passed V1 before, they would have noticed that this was happening. The fact is that at this stage in takeoff, it's no time for complex decision, making the pilot perceive that the runway was blocked ahead of him, and the way that we've been trained is that above 80 knots we're supposed to reject the takeoff basically only for engine failure and fire severe damage, or the aircraft is unsafe or unable to fly. And in this case, a blocked runway could be considered to be either unsafe or unable to fly. In any case, it's very, very hard to judge the distance ahead to the obstacle when you're on speeds like this. So I completely understand the captain's decision to reject this takeoff, and the investigators that wrote the final report about this incident did not question the captain's decision to reject either. In any case, the Boeing 777 was now rejecting the takeoff, and the first officer communicated this fact to the tower controller. The tower controller acknowledged this and started getting ready to give any type of assistance that the Boeing 777 crew might need after the rejected takeoff, and he also started to look up in the sky, where he was expecting to see the Embraer 190 departing, but it was at this point that he realized to his horror, as he was looking down on the runway further ahead, that Embraer 190 had also rejected the takeoff and was now still on the runway. At this point, the first rim cast warnings activated in the control tower first between the Dash 8 that was just about to line up on runway 06 left, and the Embraer at the very end then between the 777 that was now decelerating in the middle of the runway, and the Embraer, and finally between the Dash 8 and the 777. In the end, both aircraft managed to stop safely on the runway, and the Embraer 190 received the taxi clearance to exit the runway at the very end, and then proceed to watch the terminal building. The Boeing 777 also exited the runway from about to the midpoint, but then they had to hold on the taxiway for about 45 minutes to allow the brake discs to cool down until they were safe to continue, and after that they also continued back to the terminal building. The investigation eventually concluded that this incident had been caused by highly optimized ATC workflow in combination with pilot-applied visual separation. This, together with the bird strike that caused the Embraer to reject its takeoff, and the simultaneous transmission from both first officers about the RTO and the takeoff clearance, which eventually masked the message from the Embraer and caused all of the involved parties to lose their situational awareness. And this, by the way, is something that you might recognize from one of my other videos that I did, which had a much worse outcome. You can check it out up here. These factors, together with the fact that Rimcast hadn't issued any warning to the air traffic controller during the critical phase of this incident, because of the way that the ADS transponders on board of the aircraft had been programmed, led to the issuing of an ATC, an air traffic control information bulletin. In this bulletin, it was highlighted that certain aircraft types, including the Embraer, might have an earlier onset of in-flight indication, and that because of this, some warnings might not come when expected. There was also some experiments made by increasing the speed where the aircraft would indicate when it was airborne, but it showed that if that was done, it could lead to a much higher rate of false warnings that could eventually lead to the air traffic controller stopping to listen to Dreamcast at all. In the end, though, it was the human factor that saved the day when the pilots in the Boeing 777 realized the threat and rejected the takeoff, thus saving the situation from becoming even more critical. Now, if you want to check out the video where a very similar situation led to a much worse outcome, then check out this video up here. And if you want to support the work that me and my growing team is doing, then consider becoming a Patreon supporter. We really, really appreciate it. And I hope to see you in one of my weekly Patreon hangouts very soon. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.